Here are the sponsors for the video tour.
Our diamond sponsors include Farm Credit Canada, Van Buren Farms, Van Breek Farm Nursery. Gold sponsors include BSF, NM Bartlett, the Nova Scotia Crop and Livestock Insurance Commission, Paul Lanahan and RBC Dominion Securities, Scotian Gold, Truro Argamart, and V-Cross Nurseries. Our silver sponsors include Bear Crop Science, Bishop & Company, Corteva Agri-Science, Grindstone Creek Nursery, and Nova International Equipment. And our bronze sponsors include Cavendish Agri-Services, Eastern Drainage, Evans Manufacturing Company, Nova Scotia Farm Loan Board, Perennia, Provide Agro, TD Agriculture, Upper Canada Growers. And we also have a general sponsor, Adams County Nurseries.
We're at Birchleigh Farms right now, and there was a thinning trial done here this year. It was a repeat from last year, but I'll be really interested to see how the heat wave affected it this year. Okay, I'm going to give an update on a research project using mineral oil as an enhancer of thinning agents. And this trial was done in 2019 as well as this year in 2020. It's ongoing. So the maximum rate of 7-XLR was reduced to 3.22 liters per hectare for trellised orchard, and that was in 2018. And so this could be a challenge if you want to get some added thinning activity in a year where you've got really heavy fruit set. What we wanted to do was look at using some regular thinning products and if we could enhance the thinning that those products already provide. There are some claims that mineral oils enhance thinning agents, and some studies are reporting about 20 to 30% reduction in photosynthesis. And this is interesting because it's not just that the oil is increasing the absorption of any thinning products it's combined with. It actually on its own reduces the photosynthesis of the tree. And by reducing photosynthesis, this is a stress that can augment thinning and increase the competition between those fruitlets. So there are some thinning guides already, not locally, but from the United Kingdom, for example, that mention adding mineral oil to strengthen the thinning activity. And so we wanted to look at a local trial to see how it would behave. The mineral oil product that we used in this study was Pure Spray Green Oil, and it's a highly purified light grade oil. It's already registered as a 1% solution on apples during summer, and that's for the suppression of mites and powdery mildew, suggesting that no crop damage would occur if applied during that period of time. And so what we wanted to do with this project was to evaluate the efficacy then and the crop tolerance when applied with thinner combinations, using that new maximum rate of 7 with and without the mineral oil. So this trial was done on Honeycrisp on M26 rootstock, and the spacing was 4x14. And like I said, it was done in 2019 and 2020. So we had 8 treatments here. There was an untreated control that didn't receive any thinning treatments whatsoever. And then there was a hand-thinned comparison. And then when we get into some of these thinners here, the first one was 7 on its own. And then there was 7 with Pure Spray Green at the 1% concentration. There's 7 with Frutone, and 7 Frutone with the oil, 7 in Maxell, and 7 in Maxell with the oil. So in all the cases here where I'm going to be talking about the results, I've bolded the oil treatments so that you can compare them with their respective treatments without oil. I'll also just note here that 1 ppm of Frutone L for us is 30 milliliters in 935 liters per hectare. So in 2019, we applied the thinners at 10.6 millimeters. And in 2020, we applied the thinners at 10.4 millimeter of the king fruit diameter. And that was pretty lucky, actually, that we were able to apply during both years during a very, very close, if not exactly the same timing. So it should be a good comparison between the years. I also wanted to mention that we measured the king fruit diameter using the Orchard Tools app for smartphones. That was just released this year, but we had been working with it the year prior. And what this let us do was just, walk through the orchard with the app and record data. So we were recording 10 king fruitlets on a tree over 5 trees to get this average diameter measurement. We also recorded the initial and final fruit set by punching in the number of fruit per cluster from 1 to 5 on a representative region in that tree. So we used the app again where it had a customized keyboard with only 5 buttons where we were able to punch in how many fruit were in those clusters. And then in 2019, we hand thinned on July 31st, and in 2020, we hand thinned July 21st. This was a fairly similar development stage because 2019 was running a little bit behind. Now, here are the results of the average fruit set in 2020. You can see here that fruit set was relatively low. We also had some natural variation, making it hard to conclude some significant differences between the treatments. But we did have one difference here where the untreated tree had relatively higher fruit set and significantly higher fruit set when compared to the 7 frutone and oil treatment. This treatment here did have less fruit than the untreated tree. And that's actually consistent with the results in 2019 where only the 7 frutone and oil treatment had significantly lower fruit set than the untreated. So this is looking like a pretty aggressive thinning treatment. And for the rest of these treatments, adding oil did increase thinning according to trends. So adding it to 7 to reduce the fruit set by an additional 7%, and adding it to 7 and frutone reduced the fruit set by an additional 5%. This year, we're not really seeing a difference by adding the oil to the max cell. So now let's take a tour of a representative tree for each treatment. The first tree is the untreated treatment, and it had the most fruit set at about 23% fruit set. It's looking a little heavy here with close cluster spacing. The next tree here is the hand-thinned treatment. And we had to hand thin to get the right cluster spacing for good fruit quality. We hand thinned to a 10 centimeter separation between clusters and 1 fruit per cluster. Next is the 7 treatment. It wasn't very aggressive on its own in a year of high fruit drop. 7 and oil trended toward fewer total clusters than 7 on its own, so it tended to have a wider cluster spacing because some of those clusters were eliminated. Adding the frutone to 7 is trending toward being more aggressive than 7 on its own, and this is as to be expected. Adding the oil to 7 and frutone was even more aggressive and removed significantly more clusters than the untreated tree. Adding max cell to 7 is trending toward being more aggressive than 7 on its own, which is also to be expected. Adding oil to 7 and max cell did not cause notable differences this year. Now I also wanted to show the average fruit set from 2019 just as a reminder, and the untreated here was on the high end of fruit set at about 52% fruit set, and like I mentioned, statistically only the 7 frutone and oil treatment was lower than the untreated tree. Now here it was a little more clear that adding the oil increased thinning according to trends, where adding it to 7 was an additional 19% reduction in fruit set, and then adding it to 7 and frutone was an 18% reduction of fruit set, and adding to 7 and max cell was a 5% reduction in fruit set. The oil appears to have a greater effect when there's relatively heavy fruit set, which would, increase the thinning response because there's a lot of fruit on the tree and more competition between them. So in 2019, where we had relatively more fruit set, these differences were more clear. We also recorded the number of fruit per cluster, so we're able to determine that in 2019 we started with an average of 2 fruit per cluster after fertilization. In 2020 we started with an average of 3 fruit per cluster after fertilization. So this year it was looking like there was going to be heavy fruit set and a lot of thinning needed. But then in the end, in both years after fruit drop and after the treatments, they all averaged 1 fruit per cluster in both years with no significant differences between the treatments in the number of fruit per cluster. So where we're seeing the difference in fruit set between the treatments, it's because it's differing by the number of clusters on the tree, because some of these thinning treatments eliminated clusters. Now, I also wanted to look at the weather for both years of this trial because we did have some fairly different thinning conditions in both years. So our thinning treatment in 2020 was applied on June 16th, and I took a screenshot of the weather forecast on June 16th. And I wanted to compare it with what actually happened because I feel like this heat wave kind of snuck up on us this year. So on June 16th, it was saying there was going to be some warm temperatures coming up, 29, 30, 28, 28. But what we actually saw was 28, 31, 33, and 30 in those 4 days after thinning. So it was definitely hot. Even adding the nighttime temperatures in there, it was averaging 20 degrees Celsius as a total average temperature. We definitely had a heat wave this year. Compared with 2019, the highest temperature we saw during our thinning period for the trial was 24 degrees Celsius and averaging 16 degrees Celsius. So this was a bit uncommon this year, resulted in high natural fruit drop. We had less than half the fruit set that we had last year on the untreated tree. And 4 days after applying the thinner is what really determines the thinner response, because those thinners are starting to have activity and it's imposing a stress that's going to increase the competition between the fruitlets. So we had quite stressful conditions when these thinners were being active. And also because we had this heat wave, it's been good to know how this new strategy will behave in extreme conditions. What we saw here was some leaf phytotoxicity from the oil treatment. We checked 24 hours after the treatments and there was no phytotoxicity, but checking again 7 days later after we had that heat wave, some of that phytotoxicity was starting to show up. The phytotoxicity presented itself as yellowing and leaf drop. So it showed up more in the bottom inner canopy and the shaded areas of the tree where we're already expecting to see more stress in the leaves that are not, they don't have a lot of access to sunlight. And I'm showing the worst case scenario here in the video just to give you an idea. Overall, though, it wasn't enough to cause concern. We're looking at about 1 to 5% phytotoxicity on these trees during this heat wave. So it's good. It wasn't anything too extreme. Now here's the phytotoxicity on the 7 and oil treatment. And here's the phytotoxicity on the 7 frutone and oil treatment. Now, interestingly, there was none on the Maxellin oil treatment, and this is probably because the active ingredient is a plant growth regulator. It's 6-benzyladenine, and that active ingredient is actually a cytokinin, and it's well known to be a growth promoter, and it deters tissue deterioration. This kind of positive effect where the Maxell is preventing phytotoxicity has been observed with other thinner combinations. And so that's what we're likely seeing this year, where the Maxell had a protective effect on the leaves. Phytotoxicity is related to environmental conditions around the time of application. So unlike last year where we didn't see phytotoxicity, we did see it this year during the heat wave. Now stay tuned for fruit quality and yield. We're going to be taking these measurements this year in 2020, and that will include marketable and total yield, fruit weight, crop load, blush color, and size grading. Last year, trends indicated that adding oil increased the proportion of fruit that were marketable by 10 to 20%. There were slight increases in the average fruit weight as well, and it reduced the crop load. Again, in 2020, this hasn't been the best year for additional thinning activity, but the research is still showing there's a thinning effect by applying these oils with our regular thinner combinations. We did have some extreme conditions that we're able to see the risks of applying the oil. Now, I also wanted to show you the results from the return bloom that were recorded this spring in 2020. And how we determine the return bloom is that we count the vegetative and the floral spurs on a representative area of the tree. And we're looking to find the total percent of those spurs that came back floral. So these are some new results here. There's a lot of variation when it comes to flowering, but in all cases here we saw adequate return bloom. The crop loads last year were not very heavy, so it wasn't very prohibitive to return bloom this year. And even though there's a little bit of variation between these treatments, there's no significant differences statistically. The variation here isn't attributed to the treatments. So in conclusion, the Pure Spray Green Oil at 1% strengthens the thinning efficacy when used with product combinations. But stay tuned because I'm going to talk about this again later. The final results are still yet to come for the 2020 harvest. So I'd like to thank the Nova Scotia Fruit Growers Association and the Nova Scotia Tree Fruit Research Foundation for funding this project, along with the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture Crop and Livestock Management Trial Program. Also thanks to Birchleigh Farm's Waldo Walsh for hosting us on this farm. It's very much appreciated. And to Caitlin Congdon and Jonathan Bent, our research associates who worked on this trial, and Cassidy Coombs, our summer student who was here for both years of the research.